Welcome to the Books Brothers podcast, where each week we read, discuss, and challenge each other to become better men, and have a few laughs in the process. The Books Brothers are currently reading The Mask of Masculinity, How Men Can Embrace Vulnerability, Create Strong Relationships, and Live Their Lives to the Fullest, written by Lewis Howes. This week, Rob leads our discussion as we unpack the sexual mask. In this episode, we talk about how society or Hollywood has defined a man by how sexually active he is. The bros break down the sexual mask to find how sex is a topic we all care and think about, yet how men struggle to talk about it on a deeper level. We unpack the pain associated with unhealthy addictions to sex and porn, and how liberating and free it feels to take off the sexual mask that so many men today are hiding behind. After the show, please share your comments and feedback on the chapters by emailing us at connect@booksbrotherspodcast.com. All right, question for you guys. True or false? Candy corn is good.
Ooh, that's false. I'm sorry.
Aren't you a big candy corn fan, Matt?
I am.
Ooh,
That's what
Candy
I thought.
corn, the same
I feel like
people
most
who
people don't like it.
I don't know, the same people who like candy corn during Halloween like Peeps during Easter.
I do
sorry,
not
man.
like Peeps.
And black licorice. Like those people just are in their own category.
I'm a no-go on candy corn.
Not black licorice.
I like the candy pumpkins.
Why not black licorice? You like red licorice?
I don't really like
You got
red
something
licorice
against
either.
it?
I have
Oh,
something
okay.
against both.
Well then, you're fine then. You're fine as long as you hate both. There's no prejudice there. That's okay. I'm not going to answer that question though. I'll set myself up.
Welcome back to the Books Brothers podcast. This week, we will be unpacking The Sexual Mask, where we'll explore and digest the impacts that sex, intimacy, and pornography have on men, and how man's association to sex, in a secular sense, is only setting men up for failure in terms of true lasting happiness, selfless relationships, and self-love. The chapter is really built around a prominent character, author Neil Strauss, who wrote The Game, Penetrating the Secret Society of Pickup Artists. Author Lewis Howes shares the rise and downfall of Neil's story, how he came to earn the title of the world's best pickup artist, and the ultimate negative impacts that chasing sex had on his life. In the first pages of the chapter, we learn about Neil's past, how he toured with Motley Crue, only to not receive a single kiss while on tour, being a virgin, to where he wrote the mentioned book on how to pick up and seduce women, and how he began his escapades of sleepless nights of sex. On page 86, Howes quotes, "He was not just a man, he was the man. He became a rock star without even having to pick up the guitar." As the beginning of the chapter unfolds, Neil finds that his lifestyle is a never-ending trophy hunt that only left him feeling empty, that his sexual conquests would never satisfy him, and how he needed to make a change for the better. On page 87, Howes shares a conversation with his transformational coach around how every young boy comes to associate masculinity with issues of sexual conquest. He shares that we learn how to be a man by 1, using a woman to gratify some kind of physical need, or 2, to use her to validate some kind of masculine insecurity. How that certainly doesn't make you a man, but a user of other human beings. So, the first question is, after reading Neil's story, what was your viewpoint of him? How did you perceive him and the purpose that his book set out to accomplish? And then we'll obviously get into it as his story unfolds, but maybe we save this question for later. But did your viewpoint of him change as the chapter progressed? So first, what was your viewpoint of him? And then how did you perceive him and the purpose of the book and what it was set out to accomplish?
So my viewpoint of him during this story, I had never heard of him before this chapter. And my first impression was, good for you, man. You did what you set out to do. So you became very successful in doing it. Good job. That's not what I want to do. I don't want to live my life like that. I think if you asked me that question 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I would have been like, oh my gosh, this is the man. He knows how to get women, and I want to know how to get women. Being a middle schooler, high schooler, full of hormones, I would have been like, yeah, I kind of want to do that, but maybe not to that extent. But I wouldn't have told anyone about it also. You know, as a Christian growing up in a Christian household, also with Christian beliefs, like I want to try to stay pure, but secretly, I think deep down, I would have wanted to at least try to do something like that. But right now, no, it just sounds exhausting, to be honest. Like having to keep up all those superficial relationships and not have any real connection. It sounds extremely lonely. And sure, maybe it was fun for a little bit, but how does that impact the future and the rest of your life and your connections with people, how other people view you? People probably don't want to really know you for who you are, especially women. But yeah, I don't know. That was my first impression.
I like that, Matt. Super honest. Because you're right. Growing up as a Christian, it is hard to be as honest as you just were about, hey, I really feel like I want this, but I'm not going to talk about it. Or I feel like I have these urges or these hormones, but if I talk about it, I'm automatically wrong. So I'll just hide that, right? It's like the difference between repression and the healthy thing, which would be to acknowledge and give up those feelings in a healthy way to somebody you trust, right? Or
right.
Find an outlet, right? And that I'll admit that's something I was never able to really grasp growing up. But when I heard about Neil's story, I was honestly kind of relieved, because growing up, I was kind of like you, Matt. Like I was always kind of curious and wanted to get involved with girls, not just sexually, of course, but just in general. But I was always too shy. Like I had moved around schools a little bit growing up. So by the time I was in like middle school, junior high, and all that sort of those feelings started to happen, I was not the cool kid in school. I didn't have a friend group. I had just moved. So I was like, I'm lucky if I get some friends that are dudes before I can even try to ask a girl out or something, you know? So I guess for me, I was relieved, because he goes through this whole experience where he has sex with all these women. He's a pickup artist, and he has all these, like you said, relationships. I'm doing air quotes. And he realized that's not going to make him happy. It just ended in him regretting a lot of things. And so, like, I guess growing up, because I never had the courage to really be one of those guys who pursued women, I always thought maybe I was missing out, you know, because there's these two sides. There's like the moral side and the like religious side that I experienced, which was like, I mean, if taken to the extreme, it's like any feelings you have about sexuality feel wrong, you know? And then there's, you know, so stay away from it as much as you can. And then there's like the other side, which is the popular culture side, which as kids were probably more, well, depending on our families, I guess, and our upbringing, the popular culture side is what we experience probably more often. And that's if you kiss a lot of girls, you know, have girlfriends, have girls falling all over you, you're the man. And so like growing up for me, walking that line was, I don't know, it felt kind of impossible. So I guess for me, I just kind of took myself out of the whole game, you know? Yeah, I guess I would just say I was relieved to hear that at the end of the day, none of those things that I had thought I was missing out on growing up were actually anything to miss out on. So I was like, it kind of justified the way I chose to act growing up, you know. But I felt sorry for the guy, you know. He obviously didn't have any good male role models to show him how to treat women or like how to think about his sexuality. So I feel bad for him.
Yeah, I think when this chapter started, maybe kind of a separate take, I was a little bit discouraged. I was like, oh, we're going to have a chapter about the sexuality mask. And here he's talking about, you know, someone who's had all these sexual conquests. And even Lewis's quote talking about how he's the man that Rob had referenced earlier, I was really disappointed because I was like, this is not, you know, to me, this is, in my initial thought in the reading, I'm like, is Lewis going to be arguing that this guy has it together? But I think as the chapter progressed, you saw that no, that's not necessarily the case. But as both Matt and Thomas, both of you guys mentioned, it's interesting to say that when you were young, yeah, you were like, oh wow, maybe this guy's onto something, or maybe you looked up to another older male who was good with talking to women or dated a lot of women. But you both mentioned as you matured, as you become more of an adult, more of a man, and you stepped into those roles, you see how really the way that someone like this views women or uses women, it's really sad, and it's really an awful part of our culture that there is such objectification of women. And yeah, that someone like this would be viewed highly, that he'd be respected. And obviously in his story, there's some lessons to be learned. It takes a little while for us to see those lessons, but ultimately, initially when we were reading this chapter, I was thinking, wow, this is an interesting person to choose to talk about this topic. But I think over time it kind of makes sense, because this individual kind of externally maybe has what other men would desire, that he can get with whatever woman he wants. But then you really see deep down the depravity in that, the sadness in that. And then even as it goes on, that he, when he's in his future relationship, I think it mentions later on that he cheated on his partner. And so to me, that's a direct correlation to his prior choices.
Yeah. It's almost like comical, some of these stories so far that he's getting into, that he almost uses his interview subjects as like, he tears them down a little bit. Yeah, and you almost are curious of like the guys that are like, yeah, I'll sign up. I'll be interviewed for your book. And then it gets published and he's like, damn, like it's kind of breaking me down.
Yeah.
But this one definitely has a redemption story. I mean, we'll get into it here because I have it as part of kind of my summary still, but with the chapter and just with him, I mean, I felt slimy like during it. And I think, Stalin, you were kind of hitting on that piece. Just, I felt like this guy, the way that he was living his life, like you couldn't trust him if you were a girl and you were around him. Like you couldn't go out and just be you for a night, because you're going to have this slime ball all over you trying to pick you up. And I don't know, that was the feeling that I got. I know I shared with you guys recently, but like I just gave a talk to like high schoolers about dating and vocation and marriage and how to selfless date versus selfish dating and objectification and use. And so like just to know, right, that there's a guy out there who's written a book that directly like teaches you how to get women, like it's discouraging that there are, I don't know if he still has it out on shelves or what, that sort of resource would be out there. It kind of reminds me of Chris Wolf's like Good Guy Swag book that he came out. And it's like just thinking about the opposite of like somebody who's good, who teaches you how to treat a woman, to actually, keep a woman and not just pick her up and dispose of her. It's just really encouraging to see the opposite, which is really the reality of how to be a man.
Yeah, it reminded me too of Barney from How I Met Your Mother, and if you all have watched Barney's characters like in that show essentially feels like satire. I think especially with considering that the actor who's playing him. But that's exactly what I was thinking of as we're reading this.
Yeah, Garrett, what about you, man?
I don't know if I feel like you all covered most things. I mean, I definitely relate with Matt's point about kind of deep down, I knew what to say on the surface, but deep down, I always wondered, and I was thinking of a line. It's more of like kind of on the spiritual side, but something that like one of Brooke's mentors shared with her when we were engaged and getting married. And she said something like, "The Lord saved me from a life I'll never have to know." And I think sometimes there's like that curiosity, right? Junior high school, college, whatever, of like, am I making the right decisions? Like, is Neil Strauss's story, is that actually like am I missing out? And, you hear these testimonials and you know what the truth is, but sometimes it's hard to believe it. And so, yeah, I think the author shared his story because that was the idea. Neil embodies the thoughts or quote unquote dreams of like, you know, growing up and having all these conquests that guys have. And then it's like, no, these are actually, you know, nightmares. And I think he used Neil's story because it like checked every box of that or whatever. It was his reality. And yet it was the most and sad, you know, position he found himself in that the grass isn't always greener. I don't know. I know I'm having a lot of pauses in my comments, but it's vulnerable stuff thinking about what to say. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is for sure.
Those are just some thoughts right now.
So reading this chapter brought up a lot of memories from college, freshman year in particular. And a couple of you guys have hit on it already, but I remember a couple months into college, beginning of college, I was just like thinking, I'm free. I can just do whatever I want. There's a lot of girls around to try to get to know. And I definitely gave in to some of those desires, but I never actually slept with any of them. I did other things that I'm not proud of because I was just using those women, being a user of people. But I remember specifically there was this one girl that I thought was attractive after a couple months of college and after I hooked up with several other women at the time. And she like wasn't interested in me at all. And I was like, why? All these other women have done it. Why not you? And she's like, it's because you've been with these other women that I don't want to do anything with you. And I still remember that because like deeper down, I wanted to be a good person and someone who is capable of having a lasting, real relationship with a woman. And after she said that, I was like, oh my gosh, who have I actually become? Like, is this what people think of me? That I'm just using women? And I really did not want that to be my image. And I'm really glad she said it to me because I think that kind of changed my mindset.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be seen as someone who just uses people, uses women. I wanted to be someone who people could trust and have a long lasting relationship and future marriage that lasts.
Yeah. I was going to say, Matt, just for context, we all went to college in Springfield, Missouri in the middle of the Bible Belt. And obviously a lot of different people grew up with a different expectation or view of sexuality. And some people grew up thinking they wanted to be sexually pure for moral or religious reasons. And I think other people grew up thinking, well, if I'm willing to have sex with her and she wants to have sex with me, what's the problem? Right. And this guy's story is kind of at the heart of that, you know, like religious beliefs aside, I think it's encouraging to know, like, no matter what your position is belief wise, this is just like overindulgence in anything else that produces pleasure, right? Because on the other side of that overindulgence is pain. And to some extent, you know, I feel like in life, there's like this seesaw kind of, and you can't have too much of one side without it coming back and evening you out eventually. And I feel like with any like pleasurable experience or activity, you can find this to be true. You know, I mean, even something as stupid as using your cell phone or being on social media too much, like eventually you get depressed and they've proven that. So, I mean, it's just like, you know, no matter what your perspective is, I think it's like, Rob, I don't know what the feedback was from high schoolers, you know, when you talk with them, but I do wonder these days because, I mean, 10, 15 years ago when we were in high school, I feel like there were so many less opportunities to get involved in a way that was like, I don't know. I guess I feel like we were kind of like eased into this whole thing a little bit slower than kids these days are. And I know that's a tangent, but it just kind of makes me grateful to have grown up in a time where, high school, we didn't have Instagram and Facebook yet, really, like all that stuff was coming, but like we were sending Snapchats to each other and getting Snapchats that disappeared and got passed around school, and like all that kind of stuff is just like foreign to me. Yeah. And I mean, as a young man, I can just imagine that being really hard to navigate right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
If you're like me, you may not see that well out of one eye. I have trouble seeing things in my peripherals with one eye, particularly when it's up or down. Or maybe people think you're a bad driver. Some people think you're a good driver. It's probably 50-50, because you overanalyze and envision mathematical problems in your mind. If you're like me, then you're half Chinese, and there is hope. We are the same, but different, but still same. If you love chopsticks but also want a fork sometimes, or if people mistake you for Mexican and start speaking Spanish to you, come join our Banana Club and we can get through it together. The Banana Club, yellow on the outside, white on the inside.
That's so good.
The Banana Club.
You added Banana Club. I love it.
Let's segue in, because I know we've kind of already hit on some of these things. So obviously there's a silver lining in Neil's story. So let's just pick it up there. So as the chapter continues, we see how Neil's life unfolds, how he suffers after not only living his sex-filled life, but to where he ultimately turns it around only to cheat on his committed girlfriend, thus experiencing greater suffering. He hits rock bottom, as he describes. And he needed to be honest with himself on how he was going to change, how he wanted to be free and liberated from his addiction. He quoted on page 93, "You're more likely to fit in with other guys if you put those issues to the side and talk about your sexual conquests instead. If you want to talk about feelings or love, or whether your sex life is a really positive experience for everyone involved, forget about fitting in." He goes on to say how guys feel feminine if they talk about their struggles, and how there is darkness out there in a lot of guys, especially as it pertains to the effects of pornography at such a young age. He goes on to quote, "If you watch porn these days, it is disproportionately aggressive, how guys feel more like a man if you are dominating, and how men have become warped by this domination because young boys as early as age 9 or 10 who have never even kissed a girl are being exposed to sex in this context, as it is being their first data point of sex, how porn is creating messed up men." So first point of question, share, if comfortable, how we have all been a sounding board as men and brothers to talk about our struggles with the sexual mask. How have our relationships helped heal not only ourselves, but others?
I'll lead off with this one here. So I think as he gets into like the topic of pornography and how it affects men and that kind of thing, there's really interesting research that shows how pornography has really skewed up, like really messed up people's intimacy lives, how it's caused a lot more problems with intimacy. It's caused a lot of like sexual issues within the bedroom with partners and such. And so it's not only that pornography is objectifying to humans, but it also then as a result then causes more issues when it comes to intimacy with your real partner, because pornography it's fake. It's a fantasy that's been created. It's truly entertainment. And, as we all in this group, I would say know that, sexuality or sexual intimacy with your spouse, with your partner, it's something that it's real. It's something that a lot of the fantasy that's made up in pornography it teaches a very false narrative, as he mentions here, talking about the domination component. In a real sexual relationship, for it to be successful, there has to be give and take. There has to be really good communication.
And I just want to clarify, it's not actually entertainment. It's a forbidden fruit that people are putting out there that is distorting men's view of what real intimacy is. It's created in an effort to entertain, but it's destructive.
When I use the term entertainment, it's more to talk about where it's not real, it's fake, it's a falsehood, it's a lie that we tell ourselves. And yeah, so obviously there's a lot of destruction that comes from it. And I know as I've shared my experiences and in this area of life, I've found it's very helpful having a brotherhood, a group of guys to be a sounding board when it comes to some of your failures in life. And this is something that as men, we all deal with individually, and yet nobody talks about it, or the majority of people don't talk about it. And it's something that's a very high percentage of men are engaged and involved in this activity, and there's silence about it. And it causes a lot of shame. It causes a lot of guilt, and it messes us up with our relationships. And it's something that, as I've been open with this with other men, other friends, I found, as you mentioned, Rob, there's a lot of healing. There's a lot of growth that comes from a place of being genuine and being authentic with those in your life, and really learning that the way out of that, the cycle of shame that it can cause, is by having these conversations with other guys.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the shame part. I honestly am more convinced that the shame from this kind of stuff it's kind of the source of the intimacy issues, the, secrecy, the low self-esteem a lot of guys deal with growing up. Porn really just multiplies that for guys that don't have real life relationships or are kind of using porn to sort of, just like Neil did, to sort of paper over a lot of their masculine insecurities. And I think it's really a perfect cure for that, or at least a perfect quick fix for that, until you realize it's like the most horrible path you can go down. Like, I feel like for a lot of guys, they find it at a young age. They never asked for it. And they think, oh, this is an easy way to take care of these feelings that I don't know what to do with, or these urges that I don't know what to do with. And it's such a potent, not even, like you were talking about behavior, Stalen, but it's like the chemical cocktail that it releases in your brain. It's not something that we really evolved to deal with as men, like 200 years ago, the closest thing to any of this was, okay, you live in a small town and you maybe see like 50 women the first 20 years of your life, half of them are probably old anyway. So it's like, imagine going from that a couple generations ago to high-speed internet porn. It's just like, you're at a disadvantage so hard growing up in our society, So I guess one of the things that I just want to suggest is, like, if you're struggling with that stuff, maybe take a step back, see the bigger picture, and realize, like, man, the fact that I got into that really isn't my fault first and foremost. Yeah. But now that I know the consequences, it's my fault if I continue to let it kind of happen to me instead of trying to deal with it in my life, And I think that's a big thing, is forgiving yourself, getting rid of that shame, and talking to other people about it. That's huge.
Yeah. When I first moved to Kansas City, I got involved in a Band of Brothers group. So it was originally led by a guy that was like 5-6 years older than me. And then I ultimately ended up leading the group. But one of the things that we did every week was called PP Brat. And it basically was an acronym. It stood for prayer, purity, brotherhood, relationships, order, and tithing. So we basically talked about all of those things. Each guy, we sat in a room and we basically hit on how well are we doing in our prayer life? How well are we doing in purity, our relationships, yada, yada. And one of the big things that we always talked about, and it was good just because it was a safe space, a vulnerable space for guys to be able to share about purity. And every guy pretty much was struggling in that area. There would be highs and lows in other areas, but it was pretty consistently low that every guy was struggling in that area. And, as somebody that has dealt with that in my life, but also been victorious for that for years, it was awesome to be able to work with some of these younger guys around just really hating the sin and wanting to, work past the shame components, work past all the things that basically got them enthralled into it, but basically to be there to provide hope and provide resources and provide talks. And it's awesome when you get to see somebody come out of a very dark hole that they've been in for decades, guys. I mean, decades long of an addiction. And it's beautiful to watch people come out of that and to be a part of that. And so I would encourage anybody that's currently dealing with that to seek resources and seek your brothers to help you get out of that.
And really just to further, like, Rob, what you talk about with that is really that community component. And when it comes to purity issues and being involved in, sexual activities that you really don't want to be involved with, no one really gets out of it alone. I feel like it always takes a community of other men to be able to work through that kind of stuff with.
Do you think our culture is such that it actually makes these things harder to talk about or deal with because we have this weird dichotomy of like, let's thrust sex into everybody's face at all times, but let's never actually talk about the realities of it? I feel like
I think that
States has like a really unique culture like that a lot of other countries maybe don't have as much.
I think, quoting that page 93 that Rob mentioned, you're more likely to fit in if you put your concerns or issues to the side and just talk about your conquests and try to normalize it, try to not make it a problem. Everything is okay. I looked up, going all the way back to the preface where he references that documentary, The Mask You Live In. It's been several years, but I've seen it and it was really impactful. I don't know if I've shared this story before, but from the video or from the documentary, I recall he had a group, I think they were teenage boys, and there was it's probably like a similar scenario to what Rob did. So it would be like Rob getting in like just with a group of boys, and they like answered some questions on a piece of paper, but like didn't write their name on it. And the questions were like, I feel really lonely, or I feel really like scared to have sex, or I struggle with porn, or whatever it was. But it was like very vulnerable things that are directly identified in this chapter. Like, put those to the side, just talk about your conquest, because then you'll fit in, you'll be cool. So they all crumpled up the papers, like after they answered the questions, threw them in the middle of the circle. The leader like scrambled them up, handed out the papers to everyone. They opened it up, and then you would answer the question, but like it wasn't your answer. It was you're reading someone else's paper. Right. So there wasn't like the shame component to it. So it was like, raise your hand if you feel alone and depressed, and you would raise your hand if the answer was yes on the piece of paper. So someone else, and it was like almost everyone raised their hand, and it just illustrated. And that was the leader's point. Like, guys, we all struggle with this. We're all going through this. Well, why don't we talk about it? And I think it's the double whammy. Like we experience it, right? We'll cross over that fence, whether it's the first couple months of college, whether it's in high school or, dating, whatever it is. And we'll have a very unfulfilling experience, or there'll be a really big high. And then the next day, a lot of shame and guilt, but we can't talk about it. So let's just talk about the conquest. And, whether it's the fraternity on Sundays, the time at the end where, you like call out the guys who did something cool, or just like those things like would get brought up and like applauded, what I mean? But then deep down, we kind of know the truth, but then we don't talk about it because then we wouldn't fit in, and we wouldn't be a bro. Right.
And you've got to be a bro.
I want to say a couple things to that point. You said like doing the right thing. I think that's probably my story. There were definitely some failures, things I'm not proud of from high school and college in general. Like I would kind of put on a good front, but deep down I would have very ulterior motives. And it was all to boost my own ego because I had a very fragile identity. And
I think we all can relate to that.
Yeah. Where it's like, oh shoot, this girl likes me, that girl likes me. And so I feel better about myself. And so there's some element where it's like, sure, I may have not committed certain acts, or I may have never had sex before I was married or something like that. But, I wasn't viewing those girls or those women in my mind properly, whether it was viewing them as objects or, having ulterior motives. I was being friendly. I wanted to see if they would like me back. You know, that stuff's, you know, very real. And so it's like, is that really any better, you know, in certain regards, viewing people that way? And then the other thing I'll say, I'm not trying to segue us into the last set of questions. This stuff like doesn't end when you get married. Everyone here is married. But like, what I mean is it's not necessarily like the porn thing or like, all right, like the gates have been flown open. I think a lot of it, like the mask is put on in like a different way where it's like, okay, now I'm married. I should do this or that, or have this experience or have that experience. And it's like the struggle kind of flips on its head where there's like a similar struggle, but it might be in a different way. And I'm legitimately sharing a story of a friend. I'm not like subtly saying like, this is not subtly me, although I can definitely identify and have very similar experiences. But I remember a friend and I, we did have these, we were able to talk about these kind of vulnerable things. And he was just I was like, how's your marriage going? He was talking about how one of his friends had just got married, and he's like, oh man, like he's talking about his friend. We're having sex like 3 times a week. And he commented, oh my goodness, I'm lucky if I have sex 3 times a month or something like that. And I just like remember just comparing myself to both of those guys, or like, oh, okay, I'm like not alone in this sense. Oh, okay, it's not just me. Or, oh man, I'm like, okay, I'm that's, you know, okay, not someone's in a worse place than me, or you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, it's like, why is that on the other side of being married defining my manhood? You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think because guys don't talk about it as much, it's easier to like catastrophize when you compare yourself to other men, because you have such a scattered frame of reference. Like you don't have many data points. So you're just automatically always like, oh man, sexually, I'm just like on this low end of the spectrum compared to all my peers. You know what I mean? So I think comparison in that way is a really big issue with guys. I think you're right.
Yeah. And so you might be married. You might not have the guilt in one sense because you have that freedom now with someone you're committed to. But there still is that struggle to objectify your wife or to view her in incorrect ways where you're using her to, again, boost your ego or to feel good about yourself or whatever. And it's not self-sacrificing, anything like that. So I don't know. I mean, let me ask you, can you all relate with any of that, or am I alone in that regard?
I had expectations before, I guess. You know, before getting married, you have certain expectations about what your sex life will be like. And I think that a lot of guys struggle with that. I think a lot of guys get angry because they had expected one thing and then they realize like it takes a lot more work. And the intimacy is something that maybe they're not familiar with or they don't want to work hard at because they're just excited about the physical aspects. And I think that's a pretty common struggle that I've heard at least a few people talk about.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I know as like marriage has gone on longer for us. You know, Rob, you talked, I think last week about the task list and like the tasks. And I think sometimes to me, I can go in and out of like, I do this, and I do this, and I do this. And so I think sex sometimes becomes like, all right, now it's like time that we have sex, or now it's time we have intimacy. And I sometimes view it separate from the other things. And what I mean by that is, you know, I think, you know, there's like the famous quote that like sex starts in the kitchen, right? And so it's like, how are you treating your spouse? How are you, you know, are you loving and adoring them and building them up like constantly that they're wanting to? So I guess like as it relates to what you're saying, Garrett, I think maybe the expectations being off, or again, viewing sexuality, even within like the confines of marriage, is like more of a selfish thing. And I think that's where, as men, I think I can relate to having struggled. But yeah, the concern of objectification and viewing sexuality as selfish is a real thing. And I mean, that's something that you definitely have to continue to work at and foster intimacy within a relationship.
Does your 13-week-old daughter poop on airport floors? Or do your kids have massive blowouts at the most inopportune times? Now introducing Blowout Booty Bag. This bag attaches to your child's diaper to catch any and all excess feces that blow out past the diaper's boundary walls. Blowout Booty Bag is that extra level of insurance, so you're not covered in Graham. Cover your ears. Shit. If you buy in the next 60 minutes, we'll throw in our complimentary burp up towel. With Blowout Booty Bag and burp up towel, we've got both ends covered.
Nice. Did you like that?
I love that.
That's really
I can
good.
get behind that as a pediatrician. I like that.
Hey, many people can get behind Blowout Booty Bag.
Pediatrician endorsed.
Exactly.
One out of one pediatrician says.
There you go.
Oh my god.
What this final section's really all about. It's not necessarily that we're freed when we take off the sexual mask, forever, but it's by taking off the sexual mask, we can create the greatest relationships for the richest intimacy, right? And Howes talks about how when the sexual mask is removed, men can't hide anymore and they are forced to see the real them. And through that, they are able to love themselves more fully, deem themselves more worthy, and have greater peace and freedom for their future spouses. So I think that just kind of sums up that, hey, by taking off the sexual mask, we're just able to be more honest with our spouse, or ourselves, right? Whether we're married or not.
Or with our friends.
Right. And with our friends.
Mm-hmm.
And through that just allows, rather than, I think, one of the questions was, what are some of the freedoms that you have experienced by taking off the sexual mask? For me, locker room talk. I know we're saying some jokes and stuff and yeah, it's all fun and games, but there's some legit locker room talk with guys that guys at work, whatever, right? They want to make comments about, women and all this stuff. And I don't participate in that. You probably see that I'm pretty more reserved, where maybe in the past I was more open to make those jokes, or participate in them, if you will. But now that I'm a leader in the church and the youth, and it's just not a part of my identity anymore because I've taken that sort of mask off. You're able to not be a part of the cycle, you can stop the cycle by not participating in it.
I mean, I think it is really unfortunate too that there is such a societal difference, because we're obviously entering this era where some of this form of masculinity is really being discouraged, but yet you still see this playing out a lot in society where men are really objectifying women, or they're speaking of their conquests and such. But yeah, it's something that, when you really take a look back at it and, deep down, when guys do have kind of this more locker room style talk, or they're bragging about their experiences and stuff, what's the reason? Obviously the thought is to impress, but when you really dig back the layers on that, it's kind of a weird area to try to impress someone in.
Yeah.
Well, I think, especially whenever you've had a very close, intimate relationship with your partner, and you see how minimizing, sexual activity to such a transaction is really unfortunate. And it's really sad that happens so often these days.
Right. Now, what I don't get is how, my old boss, he was a slime bag. And he was a married man, and he would talk about women like he was a single 21-year-old.
That's pretty common.
And
I experienced that.
And how sad is that, though, right? So that's what I'm talking about in terms of how do we stop the cycle? How do we, if somebody's trying to tell you something like that, or referring to someone like that, how do you say, or when are you going to be a man and say, hey man, that's not respectful. I don't find that funny. I've said that to people, And I think people are so caught off guard that they've never really had somebody say that to them, because typically people are playing along with it or they agree with it. And so the first time somebody says something like that to them, I think it's a good opportunity for people to call out other men higher, to elevate their game, to be real men and not little boys with sexual masks on.
That is a hard line to walk, right? Especially if you're somewhere like work, where the only time anybody sees someone call anybody out is in the yearly sexual harassment training video, which makes everybody who does that look like a total square. And you don't want to be that guy, right? You don't want to be the square, but you do want to be like, hey, that's not cool. And it is hard to like know how to do that in a way that's tactful enough to where people don't lose the ability to like be real with you. You know what I mean? It's a mask that if you poke at, people will shut down and never like want to be honest with you. You know what I mean? Like if you shatter someone's mask, they're just like, I don't respect you anymore. I'm not even gonna talk to you. You know, it's with guys, they're very sensitive about it. So you have to be careful, like how you point it out, I guess, if you want to continue the conversation in a productive way.
I think of like the masks that we've gone through so far. This definitely is probably the most sensitive area for men. And it's really something that you don't see people have deep conversations with. And whereas a lot of these other areas, people can kind of unpeel some layers, but I don't feel like it's an area that the majority of men are able to be open about.
The best way to start it, in my opinion, is to talk about something you've been through first.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
If you go first, they'll realize, okay, this guy's being vulnerable, so maybe it's okay for me to be the same way. And sounds like he's been through the same stuff I have. So and some people will totally make fun of you and just be like, huh, okay, so what? Yeah. And you know, you just can't take that personally. You have to be strong enough to realize that this mask is just a mask. And the fact that you're working through your stuff is what's actually masculine, not the fact that you have a past or you have shame. That doesn't define you as a man.
Yeah. Trying to explain it to someone who does not understand how a guy feels with these urges and something that's been a lifelong struggle, I found it was really hard to try to communicate the why behind it. Yeah. And I feel like when I talk about it in church, like, I had a pretty good friend group, but no one really knew how to talk through those things and like get you to the next step, get you to the next level. Like we didn't have that expertise, that counselor to walk us through it. We would have our leaders in the church, but honestly, they would mostly just like point us to biblical verses, which is their job. It's fine, but like I never truly resonated with me.
Yeah, research shows that this is not, even though the gospel is a healing message, this is not the way to deal with it. I mean, it takes that and then some, and then more, and then that more accountability.
It's too messy. People are afraid to deal with it. Leaders and parents. Yeah.
It says when you take off that sexual mask that there's freedom, but I would also add there's a lot of pain.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
There can be a lot of pain once you take off that mask.
And
shame and guilt. And you need to have people to talk through it. People that have gone through it before, not who are also currently going through it. That helps. But I think you need someone who has gone to that next level, that next step to help you pull you up, to reach down and pull you up with them.
Yeah. Just because you're not like actively looking at porn doesn't mean you're freed of the effects of it. I mean, I think they say that it takes like 10 plus years or whatever for you to forget an image that you might remember from like a porn video. And I think that's real. And the proof is in the pudding. The studies are out there. Like this is not actually a male problem. Like women struggle with this too. And this night is pretty particularly special because every other Wednesday, Marianne leads a group with 8 women that are all over the world, all over the States, and they're basically talking about their impact, like their recovery from porn and from masturbation and from purity struggles. And so it's beautiful that we on this night, October 18th, are both doing some parallel play of talking through this and fighting the good fight and knowing that, we want to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And I think that's beautiful. Yeah. But the reality is that this isn't a male problem at the same time. Women feel those effects of shame, and I think it eats at them a lot deeper than it does for us men.
That wraps up our episode for the Books Brothers podcast. Next week, the bros will review and discuss the aggressive mask. Thanks for joining us. If you haven't yet, buy or borrow The Mask of Masculinity and follow along with us. Please subscribe and give us a review. We would really appreciate it. Also, please consider sharing the podcast with a friend or family member who you think would get something out of it. Finally, we'd love to hear from you. If you are challenged by our conversation or have any questions or feedback, email us at connect@booksbrotherspodcast.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Until then, read, reflect, and connect.